We're your hosts, Dave and Mary Jo Nutting of Alpha Omega Institute. The whole purpose of this is so that you and your part of your family can stand firm against the evolution and anti-God semi. And we'll explain that more here. Mary Jo?
Well, when we talk about the creation versus evolution issue, it has both biblical and scientific aspects to it. And we like to start with the Genesis 1 through 11 overview, which we believe once you get a handle on Genesis 1 through 11, it provides a firm foundation for the whole rest of Scripture. And so it's the undergirding of all of theology, really. And also it provides a framework for understanding science. Now, for those of you that don't know us, we didn't always believe in creation science. In fact, I grew up in a church home, and I was taught the Bible. I believed it, but in school I was taught evolution, and I ended up believing it too. And it wasn't until we found a little book one time in a secondhand store. It was called Evolution, The Fossils Say No. And I read that book. I gave it to Dave. And after we read it, we thought we better start doing some real serious study and research of our own, because everything that we had been taught in school was from an evolutionary viewpoint. And so as we studied, we became very convinced that evolution did not work, and that creation was, in our mind at least, a much better explanation scientifically for the origin of the universe, the earth, and all the living things on the earth, and a better explanatory framework for understanding true history of this world that we live in. And then later on, we really came from evolution to creation on a science background. And then later on, we went back and we looked at the Bible and we said, how in the world could we think that God was involved at all in the evolutionary process? That idea, by the way, is called theistic evolution, where the idea is that somehow God is involved in evolution, that he maybe used evolution as his method of creating. And I believed that for a time, but the more we studied, we said that's not good science, and it's not good theology. And so we're part of the group of people that believe that God's word is true from the very beginning. We believe that Genesis 1 through 11 is historically accurate account of the creation of the world and the entrance of the sin and death into the world, and then the destruction of the flood and the dispersion after Babel. And so as we look at those things, we are let me just go through it quickly. Genesis 1 and 2 talks about creation, and that God is the creator of all things. And Genesis 1 tells us that he created everything in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. And we find that in Genesis 1 and 2. But then it says at the end of that creation period, everything was very good. And so we see evidence, if we look from a scientific point of view, we see evidence of beauty and design and complexity, amazing complexity that we see in living things. And then something happened, didn't it? Something happened to this good world that God created. The Bible gives us an explanation for the origin of death and suffering and pain and thorns and thistles and all the things that we have to deal with in this fallen world. And the Bible tells us that by one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin. Evolution, of course, says that mankind came about as a result of years and years and years of death and struggle and decay and so on. But the Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible teaches mankind came about as a direct creation of the Creator God, and that later on, as Adam and Eve fell into this sin, that's the origin of death and suffering. So there's a theological contradiction between Genesis
Yeah.
and evolution, really. As we look around the world, we see all kinds of evidence of evil and struggle and decay and pain and so on. And so that we tie back to Genesis 3 and actually on through chapter 5. And you read the genealogies in Genesis, and over and over and over again it says, and he died, and he died, and he died. It's become, what we see in this world. Well, when we move on to Genesis 6 through 8, we find that wickedness and evil and violence had filled the earth. And God said, enough is enough. And he brought the flood to destroy that sin from off of the earth. It says Noah was found, he was a man of faith. He had grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so Noah was instructed, build that ark, take on it 2 of every kind of unclean animal and 7 of clean animals of the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. And that ark became that ark of safety then through that flood. We see scientifically, what do we see? We see evidence of great amounts of catastrophic geology coming from this year of the flood. We see evidence of fossils contained in the very rock layers, and the rock layers themselves indicating very thick deposition of earth and soil and rocks and so on that had been whipped up by this flood. And so we see the evidence in the rock layers themselves. And then we see evidence of the erosion that took place after the flood. And Dave will be talking about that, I believe, Thursday, is it, Dave?
Yes.
And then we move after the flood. Noah and his family get off the ark, and we see they began to be fruitful and multiply as God had told them, but they didn't want to fill the earth. They wanted to all stay together to make a name for themselves, to build a city. And they ended up trying, we believe this was a tower to worship the hosts of heaven. And God didn't plan it that way. He said no, and he confused their languages, and we call it the Tower of Babel now because the languages were confused there, and then people dispersed around the earth as God had originally told them they should, but they needed a little bit of extra help, a little bit of a kick in the behind, I think, to get them to spread out. And those languages we see all around the earth, and we've done a fair amount of teaching in other countries with different languages, and I got to say, God did a really good job when he confused the languages. Very hard to communicate. But we also see the animals dispersing at that time after the time of the flood, and we believe there was a ice age that occurred probably sometime within a few hundred years after the flood also, which we can talk about in some of the other programs that we do. So this, if you can get in mind this Genesis 1 through 11 account, it will help in understanding the rest of Scripture, and it'll also help in understanding science. Of course, there's all these anti-God philosophies that want to cross out and negate all of these things. They want to negate the idea of creation and design and the fact that God designed all this in the beginning and that he created it. And that he created Adam from the dust of the earth and Eve from the side of Adam. And they just put a big X through it. They don't also want to recognize that is the beginning of death, was when Adam and Eve sinned. They don't want to recognize the flood and the destruction that came there. They choose instead to interpret the rock layers and the fossils they contain as millions and millions of years old. And so, and then of course the Babel and the dispersion from there is also kind of laughed at oftentimes by these anti-God philosophies. So we wanted tonight and over the next couple of days just to give you some, a crash course, Dave likes to call it. We're going to give you some good evidences that we can believe the biblical account of creation, and from a scientific point of view, that it holds up. And so tonight we're going to be talking about biology and design. We
This whole
really have,
section,
yeah, go ahead, Dave.
yeah, the whole section is basically, did God create, or did evolution create everything out of nothing? In other words, so we're going to be looking at that. The idea that we're going to be trying to focus on and show the major problems with is an anti-God philosophy that is being presented in schools around this country and around the world. It is the idea of naturalism. Now, let me just tell you what naturalism is real quick. It is a worldview that everything in the universe, including the universe itself, came about only by natural processes. And that not only that, but all the matter came about natural processes. And then somehow or another, these little particles of matter got together and formed stars and galaxies, and eventually there was a planet called planet Earth. And then there was a lightning zapping through the atmosphere, hitting the chemicals in that atmosphere wherever they came from, and then made bigger chemicals called amino acids that lined up like beads on a string to form an active protein. Well, that protein plus a whole bunch more, literally hundreds and hundreds of proteins, accidentally got together, and a bunch of other stuff involved made the first cell. And then that first cell went on to become you. And we call that cell to human evolution. And it is what we refer to as the goo to you by way of the zoo method of getting life. And this naturalism is what is being taught. And I like to say it is not science. It is specifically a philosophy of how we got here on Earth that is posing as though it were science. And this is the philosophy that is actually running over an awful lot of students. Let me show you the philosophical aspect and ask you, is it science or philosophy? According to naturalism, the whole universe burst into something from absolutely nothing. That's exactly what it says on the cover of Discover magazine, which is a magazine 100% committed to the idea of naturalism. They said the universe burst into something from absolutely nothing, zero, nada. And as it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere. And then they have that question, how is that possible? And then they give some kind of a explanation, or not an explanation, but a theory. It really doesn't explain much. And that is naturalism. Think about it, though. Something from absolutely nothing and nothing exploding. That doesn't sound like solid science, does it, Mary Jo? I
Now,
think
how can
it's
nothing explode?
no, how can nothing explode? I think that's philosophy, isn't it? It's a philosophy, again, posing as though it were science. And we have to watch out for that. Here's naturalism at work. Here's a professor was at the Colorado State University. He said, we must concede there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. You know what? That's exactly right, isn't it? But here's what he said just prior to that. We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. In other words, we have to instead look for a naturalistic origin, even though we have no clue how it could have happened. And some people say we do it because we don't want to have God in the picture. All right. And so You might have seen some of the old Stanley Miller experiments, right? And the Urey Miller. They produced simple amino acids, and they did it in a lab. And of course, so many newspapers and even a text claimed life was produced in a test tube. You know what? That's a big stretch, okay? Yeah, you can do some biochemistry. Take the right chemicals, mix them together, put an electrical discharge to it, and sure enough, you can produce something that would be a basic, simple amino acid. But the problem with that system is the same environment that produces those amino acids don't allow them to stay there. They are actually destroyed at a rate faster than they are produced. And so in that experiment, you see the thing in the bottom called the trap. You had to get them out of that environment quickly. Otherwise, there'd be some destruction there. And so what you do is you distill that down and hopefully you have your amino acids. It sounds good, but even this is one of those that would be called a wishful speculation because it is not life, even though the newspapers and texts claim it is. At least they did back then. There's so much more to a cell. And by the end of tonight, you'll understand why I say that. Okay, amino acids are not life. They got the wrong types of amino acids. And the environment already mentioned would destroy the product. And you have to organize those particular amino acids in exactly the right order to make the next step of life, which would be a protein. And that is paramount, that you get in exactly in the right order. So no, Stanley Miller experiment was interesting, but it did not explain the origin of life. Go ahead, Mary Jo. Oh, I will. Another wishful speculation. Because we see on Earth that it doesn't look like it's even possible or probable to accidentally get life. They said, well, life was seeded on Earth by aliens. This really just begs the question because where did the aliens come from? Where did that life come from? And we see that it just pushes it out somewhere in the universe. So, again, a wishful speculation. Another one, life evolved in some kind of a thermal feature, like a hot pool, which you might see at Yellowstone National Park if you go on tour with us there and our creation tours. But guess what? No, we haven't seen life popping out of pools. We have life in those pools, but God seems to create and fill every niche of his creation, doesn't he? Okay, now in 2018, a report came out. Amino acid was detected in an oceanic hydrothermal vent. Oh, great. And that is a type of amino acid that is sometimes found in life or is found in life. So guess what? They said, we found it. So what's the big deal about that? Well, doesn't really make much difference. In fact, you're going to have more than one amino acid. You're going to have a whole bunch of them. But how do you, even if you had all of the amino acids necessary to produce a living protein, what is the chance of making one simple protein by accident? Well, I'm a mathematician as well as a geologist, and I used to teach college statistics. So for one of the class sessions, for just a short little piece of it, I applied something we were learning that day to creation versus evolution. And I said, what's the probability of getting one simple protein strictly by accident? And we set the parameters and we realized it's not going to happen. The number of the probability of evolving one simple protein was one chance in the number 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 260 times. For those who don't have a grasp of such a big number, that is like finding an odd colored, say a red marble, in a universe filled with green marbles. and finding that marble blindfolded 3 times in a row. If you can do that, that's 100 million times easier than making that one simple protein. And then I said something to the effect of this. I don't know what they teach you about these kind of odds in biology, but in statistics, we call that zero. And guess what? That was 5 minutes before I heard from the department chairman saying, I understand you're preaching religion in the classroom. Well, no, I showed the professor, I was glad to do it, the head of the department, exactly what I showed the students. I said, is that religion? He said, well, absolutely not. He said, I guess not. And he said, but you better drop it. This creation evolution controversy stuff is a big, big sore point here at this university. And well, he didn't quite say it that way, but we understood. I didn't drop it. And that's why we're doing these creation evolution presentations all over the country. All right. The, that's just the chance of getting one protein. That's not even life. Okay. The chance of getting life, according to a, let's say, atheist and agnostic who independently calculated it, was one chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. They said, it's kind of like a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and producing a Boeing 747 complete and ready to fly. And then they said there must be a God. But they didn't run out to buy a Bible to find out about that God. They said in the article, we are still looking for a way around our conclusions. Why would they say that? Because they're committed to the philosophy or the worldview of naturalism, that everything has to be explained, even if the odds against it are amazingly hard. So that's what they say. Dr. Scott Todd said it this way. He was one of the guys pushing the legislation, pushing the court case that you can't even mention intelligent design in a classroom. And his idea is this: even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. See, students are being put in a box. They cannot be even given any information that would be against the naturalistic point of view. And they have to find a naturalistic explanation. And students are told over and over and over again that God is excluded from science. And they're told God has no place in science. And in fact, we can explain everything without God. Well, that isn't the case, but the students believe it because they're chained to that particular philosophy. They need to be set free. And that's part of the reason for this crash class. Okay? So, anyhow. So, what's the answer? According to 1954 article, clear back in back then, Scientific American, George Wald said, time is in fact the hero of the plot. We have 2 billion years to play with. He said, given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible, probable, and the probable, virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. Guess what? Naturalism is also a faith statement. Even going against all odds, they said we've got to come up with a naturalistic explanation, and time is the hero of the plot. Actually, you find out time is not the hero of the plot. It goes against the origin of life problems. So again, take this with you whenever you wherever you go. Evolution is not science. It is a philosophy or a worldview posing as though it were science. And what does Scripture say, Mary Jo?
Colossians 2:8 says, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception according to the tradition of man, rather than according to the elementary, or rather than Christ. And that's not quite an exact quote, I guess. But what we were doing a seminar one time up in Oregon, and at the end of, Dave was talking, and at the end of that time, a man came running up to the table in the back where I was at the book table, and he says, your husband just changed my life. And I went, what did he say? What happened? He said evolution is a philosophy. He said, I always thought it was science, but if it's philosophy, it's just an idea. It's not proven science. And it made such a huge difference to him in his life at that point. But so many students don't ever get to hear this. And so they're chained to this idea of evolution. In fact, a friend of ours who did a lot of teaching on campus and evangelism for students told us one time the number one reason students give for rejecting the gospel is evolution. And according to our experience on campuses all around, that really remains true. It also is one of the main reasons why students end up leaving their faith or leaving the church, is this whole idea of evolution and being taught that it truly, they think it's a fact. They don't think it's a philosophy. So these students were run over by that semi that says evolution and anti-God philosophies. Well, why did that happen? Why did it happen? They were not prepared. They had never been really prepared in their faith, in a real understanding of scripture, perhaps, plus also not in the area of science. So everywhere they went, that's all they were taught was evolution. That's what happened with me. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home. I believed the Bible, but when I went away to college, I was taught that evolution was a proven fact. And it really undermined my faith for quite some time, until I really got a hold of this idea that evolution is not science. It's not a proven scientific fact. So tonight, we just want to give you some more of that kind of thing. And our hope is that this information will help you and those that you talk to, those you interact with in your own life, to stand firmly on the Word of God and stand firm against these evolutionary philosophies. Really, it comes down to, when you're looking at science, it really comes down to a matter of what's your worldview, or what color is your filter. If you look at a white wall through red sunglasses or through a red filter, that wall's going to look red or pink, isn't it? Or if you look through green, it'll look green. But what we want to do is to have God's interpretation. So as we look at science and as we look at scripture, we want to be able to look at it through the eyes of our Creator God, and to get that clear understanding of what's going on. Because our worldview really can affect our interpretation of the data. Now, the data itself is the same. Whether or not you believe in creation or evolution, the data should be the same if it's honest data. But oftentimes, your interpretation of that data is impacted by your worldview. That's why we can have two good scientists, one of whom says, oh, wow, isn't evolution wonderful? And the other one's looking at the very same data and going, wow, what an awesome creator we have. What is it? It's their worldview that's making a difference. It's what are you willing to accept? So when we look at this whole issue of creation and evolution, creation, we mean that humans are a special creation of God, that we were created in the image of God, and that from Adam and Eve, we get all the human beings that have ever lived on this earth. Evolution would say, no, everything came about through this process we like to call the goo to you by way of the zoo. The evolutionary process, that people came from ape-like creatures, which in turn came from other more simple or primitive creatures, until finally you just get back to to a blob, a cell, or way back to the chemicals, as Dave showed you before. Tonight, as we look at evolution and creation, we're going to look at some of the supposed evidences of evolution. And we've grouped these into three categories tonight. One is change, second is similarity, and the third is junk. And we've found that if we can give you some categories of information, it will help to organize the data that we have in some sort of a structure that's easier to remember. So the first is change. And why is that? Well, the word evolution simply means change. So if I'm going to ask you, do you believe in evolution? I hope that you would ask me a couple questions in return. You might ask, well, what kind of evolution are we talking about? How much change and what kind of change are we talking about? Are we talking about molecules to man, or this idea of mega evolution? Or are we talking about changes within a basic type, or from one type of thing to another? Macroevolution, the origin of new types of things. I remember Dr. Gish liked to call this kind of evolution from fish to philosopher. And the guy at the top there is contemplating, I guess, his whole evolutionary history as he has that fish looking up at him off of his plate. Or are we talking about the idea of microevolution, which we would call variation within a created kind, which is basically saying that the basic types of things were created in the beginning by God, and that what we see is variation within these created kinds, but not from one kind of thing to another kind of thing. And it's really not evolution then, it's variation that was, we believe, that ability to vary was built into the beginning as God made these creatures. Why would we say that? Well, God told the animals and he told the human beings to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Now, if they're going to have to spread out and fill the earth, there's going to need to be some ability to adapt to differing climatic conditions and differing conditions on the earth. And so we see that with, for example, the dogs. You see big dogs and little dogs and chihuahuas and St. Bernards. And guess what? They're all still dogs, aren't they? They don't change into anything else. They're always going to be dogs. And so you can get all that variation, yes, but that is not evolution in the way that we're talking about it. But tonight, what we want to look at then is some of the common evidences of that are given as evidence of evolution in action. So let's take a look at some of these kinds of creatures. Of course, the finches of the Galapagos Island were very famous. Those were around in Darwin's day, and Darwin took that 5-year voyage on the vessel all around the world, and he stopped at the Galapagos Islands. He saw these finches, and they appeared to have different body shapes a bit and different beak shapes. He supposed that they had come from a common ancestral finch who flew across the ocean and then he landed on these Galapagos Islands, and as time went on, that this diversification took place. Well, I don't have too much of a problem with that, but it's not a matter of evolution. It's a matter of variation within the finch kind. Because what do we start with? You start with finches. What do you end up with? You end up with finches. Nothing really fundamentally new. And actually, the research that's been going on lately shows that these changes, or the variation in the beak structure, can actually be correlated to changes in the environment, or wet and dry seasons, and it can go back and forth. It's not like it's settled on one. And so you get a lot of variation in the finches, but it's not evolution. It's just variation within a kind. Peppered moths is another one of this kind of evidence of evolution that's often given. The story was that before the Industrial Revolution, these moths were around in Great Britain. There were light ones and there were dark ones. But they say at that point in time, the air was nice and clean and the tree bark was light colored, and they show the light colored moths blending in better on the tree bark than the dark colored moths. And the idea was there are more of these light colored ones. They're better camouflaged. Well, then what happened was the Industrial Revolution, and it brought along with it pollution, and tree barks were darkened by the polluted air, the coal, when they started burning coal and so on. And pretty soon they said that there were more dark moths than light ones. And that book, this is oftentimes given as evidence of evolution, sometimes called the best evidence. Well, it's evidence perhaps of natural selection if it's a good day, if it's good data even. But the latest things that are coming out have shown that this is not even good data. These moths, what do you start with? You start with light moths and dark moths. And what do you end up with? Light moths and dark moths. Nothing fundamentally new. And then they found out that these moths don't even naturally rest on the trunks of the trees. They fly around at night, and then during the day they just rest up in the leaves of the trees. And in order to get the pictures that are so famous, they had to actually stick them on the tree bark. Oh, excuse me. Back in 2002, in the book Icons of Evolution, Jonathan Wells exposes this peppered moth myth as a myth. It's not science, it's a myth. And it's kind of a myth that proves evolution in their mind. And then in September of 2012, the Journal of Evolutionary Biology had an article that confirms what Jonathan Wells was teaching in 2002. And so today, as we look at this thing, we go, well, even if it was real, it still doesn't prove evolution. It just proves there's variation within that created kind. But there's a lot of doubt now whether that's even a good kind of data at all, or if it's really just, some sort of a myth that's been proposed. But what about antibiotic resistant bacteria? Isn't that evidence of evolution? And viruses and so on. We've heard a lot about the evolution that's taking place in the COVID viruses and so coronaviruses and so on. Well, is that really true? Well, what do we see? We see the same kind of thing that we saw with dogs and moths and finches. We start with bacteria. We end up with bacteria of the very same kinds of bacteria. Nothing fundamentally new. Yes, variation within a kind, but evolution, no. And so when people say, well, this is evolution in action, we can see it, we've got proof of it, we go, no, that's not what we see. It's not the kind of evolution that involves goo turning into you. If anything, it might be an evidence of microevolution, but that would be all. What about the various races? Dave, you want to talk about the races?
Yeah, well, Darwin thought the various races came from different species of monkeys. Okay, and used to refer to some of the black races as basically what do you call it? What's that word I'm thinking about?
They came from more primitive forms of apes.
More primitive, yeah.
Darwin actually thought that the various races came from different species of monkeys. And in fact, when Rich and Lanny on our staff went to Africa, they were teaching in a totally black church, and one of the pastors came to, and there was a pastors' conference, and one of these pastors came up to Rich, I think it was, and said to him, well, what kind of monkey do we come from, and what kind do you come from? Because they had been taught this idea of evolution, and they thought that they were less evolved than the white people. And after Rich went through this little section that we're going to show you now about the origin of the races, these pastors started getting up and they started praising God to find out, wait a minute, we are all equal. There really is only one race. It's the human race. Mm-hmm. But then that leaves the question, well, how do you get all the different skin colors if indeed we started from just Adam and Eve? Well, you can explain it very easily if you look at a Punnett square, which is very well known within genetics. And that Punnett square shows in a simplified fashion, if you start with medium skin colored parents with the biggest variation of skin color, the heterozygous condition, they call it, you can get all the way from the darkest dark to the lightest light skin color in one generation. It doesn't take millions of years. And then actually we can see some of that happening today. If you look at this is parents, medium skin color, and they have one dark child and one very light child. These are sisters, same parents. They're genetically, that they just have the genetic variation within them that you can play around with that Punnett square and figure out how that happens. But it's very interesting. You can get these kinds of variation then. Well, then we might ask, well, why then do we have certain characteristics that seem to be more characteristic of various people groups around the world? You can then begin to understand that in terms of the Babel and the dispersion, because as people spread out from Babel, God spread them out according to families and tribes and so on. And as that happened, we could see various of these skin colors becoming cemented within certain populations. And so we end up with all the variables that we see today, all the variation we see today. There really is no room for racism in a biblical worldview, but racism is very consistent with the evolutionary worldview. And you don't hear that too often these days, but that's the way it is, and it fits with science.
Well, Mary Jo, what is the main mechanism of Darwinian evolution?
Well, Darwinian evolution was based on natural selection. He didn't know about mutation.
Yeah, right.
And so he just thought survival of the fittest. And he knew there was variation in nature, but he didn't know where it came from. Later on, more scientists that came along, they recognized the idea of mutation. And so they combined mutation plus natural selection in the idea of what's called neo or new Darwinian evolution. And the idea with that is that, there's mistakes and accidents that happen and changes from one generation to the next. And those that are best suited to a particular environment will be those that survive. Well, here's a couple of problems with that is neither mutations nor natural selection can create anything. They can only operate on things that are already in existence. If you're going to have a mutation, you have to have the genetic material there to be mutated. And so it doesn't create new things. And then the selection can only operate on what's already there. I mean, if I give you a choice of orange juice or apple juice, you can't get grape juice out of that. And so mutation and natural selection can't explain how we get all these new traits. But then again, what do we actually observe that mutations will produce? I mean, we see things like two-headed snakes and cattle with an extra leg and roosters without any feathers and all sorts of varieties of fruit flies, deformed and mutant fruit flies. And yet they're still fruit flies. Whenever flies mate, they have fruit flies. They don't change into anything else. So you can get flies with different shapes on their wings and different colors on their body. And the one on the left there has 4 wings.
That's got to be good, right?
Well, you would think so, huh? But it says normal fruit flies have 2 wings. This mutant has 4. This rare mutation, like most mutations, is harmful. And then look what it says, beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. Now they're making a big assumption there. They are assuming that you can get beneficial mutations, or that there at least are enough mutations that are helpful, beneficial, that they can derive this evolutionary mechanism all the way from the goo to you by way of the zoo. But yet we know that's not the case. I mean, if mutations are beneficial, then why don't we advocate more nuclear testing and increase the mutation rate? What do we see? The observed results with mutation are duplication of information, like four-winged flies instead of two-winged flies, loss of information, like flies that don't have any wings, deregulation of genetic information. That's what happens in cancer cells where they just go wild. Or you might see aging and death as observed. Now remember, science is based on observation and experimentation. So what do we see here? The results we see based on observation tells us that mutations are going the wrong way. They're not the primary driver of evolution.
Mm-hmm. And that is basically what Dr. John Sanford wrote about in his book, Genetic Entropy. Entropy is basically a measure of things going downhill, you might say, loss of information, loss of heat, etc. And Dr. Sanford, in his book, says that the primary axiom of Darwinian evolution is that evolution gets better or proceeds by these mutations, which are harmful, and the maybe a few beneficial ones selected for positively by natural selection. But he says that primary axiom does not work. Now, keep in mind, Dr. John Sanford is not just some person out there in the left field. He's a retired Cornell University professor and genetic researcher. He published 70 peer-reviewed scientific articles, has 25 patents, and that was several years ago, of genetic research. He knows his stuff. He's also the co-inventor of the gene gun process, which helps sequence the DNA. So he's well respected in his field, but he said mutation, natural selection doesn't work. Here's what he said after he's done so much research on it. And he thought evolution was going to be the savior of the world, you might say. And if we could do genetic information and genetic modification, maybe we can preserve the human species. But all of his research said it's not working. He says in his book, careful analysis on many levels consistently reveals that the primary axiom, evolution proceeding by mutation and natural selection, the primary axiom is absolutely wrong. He says mutational downhill appears to be so strong, especially within large genomes, that selection should not be able to reverse it. Too many mistakes. It's going downhill instead. He said it is now clear the mutation selection cannot stop the loss of genomic information. So mutation selection clearly could not create the genome. And I like this part of it too. If mutation selection can't prevent the degeneration of the genome, then the primary axiom is wrong. It is not just implausible. It is not just unlikely. It is absolutely dead wrong. It is not just a false axiom. It is an unsupported and discredited hypothesis which can be confidently rejected. So, students, if you hear a teacher, a professor, wherever says, well, we know evolution proceeds by mutation and natural selection, the primary axiom, you can reject that really quickly. And this is based upon one of the top genetic researchers around. Okay. Here's another one too. They said, "Oh, here's proof." And students are kind of mixed up because sometimes we get one little piece of information and they said, aha, that looks like evolution. And now all the students across the university, when we go to speak there, they always say, well, what about? And they mention something. What about, in this case, E. coli bacteria? Well, they actually evolved to use citrate. Okay, great. It turned out that yeah, they did. So what? They were able to use citrate. They couldn't do it before. And I think they went through a huge experiment. The guy had a lot of patients, 31,500 generations. And that's to finally use citrate. Well, that would be in human terms, in order to get one little mutation to allow one thing possible, that'd be like 630,000 years for that to happen. Okay. Turns out when we actually look at it, this was a downhill mutation of a working system that got broke. So in order for something to be better, a good working system had to be broken. That's the downhill way of going things. It's not going to produce the goo to you by way of the zoo. Okay. And so, yeah, don't worry about these little tiny pinpoint things. Say, well, what about this little fact? We hear that all the time, and they can try to dismiss everything a professor or like somebody like Mary Jo or me would tell them, because they think they have one evidence of evolution, and it may not even be good evidence at all.
So,
Okay.
Dave, what's the alternative to mutation and natural selection?
You say,
What,
what's the alternative?
what's the alternative? You're going to get to it in the next slides.
Okay, I see design. I think
Okay.
the alternative would be it's design. We look at things, mutations, and you look at it and say, I don't think it's going to produce it. Is it, Mary Jo?
Nope. What about the bombardier beetle?
What about it, Mary Jo?
It's kind of become a classic evidence among
Yeah,
people.
it has.
It's been around a long time, but these little bombardier beetles are actually able to shoot out boiling hot gases out of the back end with the rapidity of a machine gun. And if you, they've been, when they've recorded it, they can actually hear it go brrr, kind of as it pulsates. But how in the world could something like that evolve? You have to have all sorts of different kinds of the chemicals that need to be there, the hydroquinone and the hydrogen peroxide, and they have to be produced by special glands, and then they need to be mixed together in a mixing chamber. And there's muscle that goes between them in order to control this thing. And you get this explosive gas coming out at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And not only that, but this little creature is able to aim where it's going to shoot.
Yeah.
Now, think about it. How in the world did that come about? I mean, did one day a beetle go, well, I'm tired of getting chased by frogs? And he went
Yeah.
into the chemistry lab and he started randomly mixing chemicals together. And sure enough, one day he got the right combination and kaboom. Instead of getting a better beetle, we got a dead beetle. And now he's not able to tell his young beetles, don't do that, because he's not around anymore. So when you look at these complex interrelationships of parts, like we see within the bombardier beetle, we can say, no, it's designed. The evidence is there that says it's designed. It didn't happen just by accidents and chance.
Yeah, it looks like an engineer did that.
Yeah,
A good engineer, that is. So
well,
that's
but
one evidence.
naturalism says we can imagine
Oh,
how
yes, right.
mutations and natural selection acting over millions of years might refine or produce such complex systems. But notice the words there, imagine and might. Those aren't exactly scientific terminology, although you can imagine it. It could be the basis of a hypothesis, but it's certainly not the kind of thing that you would say if it had been demonstrated very well by science. What about these, Dave? These are one of your very favorite examples of design.
Yeah, the blue morpho is amazing, absolutely amazing. And when you look at it, do you realize the blue morpho is not blue? What do you mean? I'm seeing it right there,
Yeah,
right?
look,
It looks blue, doesn't it? Look at the underside of the blue morpho butterfly, and you find out that, wait a minute, this is the underside of it. Doesn't look blue at all there, does it? So what's going on? Is it different paint on the front or on the top versus the bottom? How did they get its blue color? Well, actually, the wings of the blue morpho on the top are actually colorless. It's made out of a protein and it's called chitin. And basically, each scale is like that, clear. How do you get that intense blue color? It turns out it's the arrangement of the particular laminae that are on that wing or on each scale that gives it a special coloration. Now, what happens is light comes through these clear things, and what happens is it's called constructive interference. Everything else is basically screened out. The blue comes in, or the one part of the light is actually comes in, and it is actually, you might say, magnified coming out. So, wow, it's amazing. But those laminae have to be exactly perfect. And if you want to know more and more detail about that, go to discovercreation.org and look under Blue Morpho. Just search for that, Blue Morpho, and you can see an article written by aeronautic engineer Bill Browning. He said the spacing of the laminae, these little laminae look like trees right there, right? The spacing of the laminae must be precisely controlled to a certain fraction of the wavelength. Approximately 1 million layers of these laminae are meticulously arranged with incredible accuracy on the wings. Now, when you hear that kind of language is talking about that, you say, how in the world do you do that by accident? Precision. That sounds like an engineer designed that. I believe that engineer is God. I like the passage in Psalm 111 that actually speaks about that. The works of the Lord are great, sought out by all of them that have pleasure therein. His works are to be remembered. And I hope you will take this one example, if nothing else, Blue Morpho, and say, wow, we can remember he is our creator, designer, God. I love that thing. Okay.
about the eye. You know,
Yeah.
Charles Darwin said he said when he thinks of the eye, it makes him shudder. And he knew that his theory of evolution by natural selection could not explain complex structures like the human eye. Now, again, naturalism will say, well, we can imagine mutations in natural selection could produce these systems over millions of years. But, does that really work? What other answers do evolutionists provide? Richard Dawkins said the eye has an absurd design. Now,
Yeah.
we have a friend in Costa Rica who is an eye doctor, an eye surgeon, and he was part of our training program in Costa Rica. And he ended up doing a program for us during that program or that course. He put together a course, a little program on the eye, but just the cornea of the eye. He could speak for hours or more on just the design of the cornea. But then later on, he expanded that lecture to make a whole hour lecture on the eye. Absolutely phenomenal. He would not agree with Richard Dawkins that it's absurd design. He would show you how exactly that works so well.
In fact, if Richard Dawkins designed the eye like he thought it ought to be, and that's how his eye would be, Then he'd go outside in a bright sunny day and he would be blind in 2 hours because the stuff that he calls a mass of material in the wrong spot is actually ends up being like a pair of designer sunglasses. It's a UV protector and it keeps them from getting blind. But God knew what he was doing when he made our eye to be able to function in the environment we are in. Think about my computer. It's amazingly designed. Well, there are days I might argue about that as I'm ready to throw it through the window. But we do know it's amazingly designed. Now, nobody would think that my computer was not designed. And yet, people will look at your brain, which is even better than my computer, and look at the microchip and all the computer stuff that it looks like is happening in our brain and say, oh, it just happened by accidents, by mutations, working with millions of years, right? And natural selection. And guess what? We found out that doesn't work, according to Dr. John Sanford. Your brain is much better than my computer. So, what could be the natural conclusion? Your brain was designed just like my computer was, but it was designed by even a better designer. All right. You know, the number of uh, synapses in a brain is roughly equal to the number of stars in 1,500 Milky Way sized galaxies. That's a bunch. There's a bunch of connections. A single brain has more switches than all computers and routers and internet connections on the face of planet Earth. And just to think that it happened by accident, what does naturalism then say? All right. And I think that we should allow thinking. All right. Even in the classroom, you know, we might be taught about it coming up, but I think thinking is allowed. All right. I think thinking is allowed. Here's what naturalism will say because they have to explain it without God. Perhaps. Get that word perhaps? Not scientific. Perhaps an early cell billions of years ago developed a sensitivity to other cells. Then it is conceivable it would be on its way to becoming a human brain. Steal a line out of a famous movie. I think it's inconceivable. But to understand, perhaps inconceivable are not scientific terms. It is the faith of naturalism, and it's trying to explain it without God. And when somebody says that, who is in a professorship position, the student says, oh, I guess it's conceivable. If he thinks so, maybe I ought to too. Okay. No, that student is being put in a box of naturalism and chained to it, the ball and chain. And we have to understand that thinking is allowed, okay? But we're told, no, you can't think. You can't think out of that naturalistic box, okay? So I don't care what kind of design we're talking about, whether it be the eye or the brain, the blue morphle and the bomber beetle, or any of a multitude of things we might look at as design. The answer that I will normally get on a university campus when we were speaking there is that naturalistic explanations can explain it. And those explanations always rely on the heroes of time coupled with mutation, which are mistakes, and selection. Given enough time, anything can happen, we hear students say. Well, guess what? I don't think that that's a very good explanation whatsoever. Keep in mind, Mary Jo, what does John Sanford say?
Yeah, remember what John Sanford said, mutation selection can be confidently rejected. They don't
Mhm.
explain evolution the way that we've been taught.
And the
So
more
as
time you have, the worse it is.
yeah, and people are telling us now, we've heard on the university campus, they'll go, oh, but we have multi-universes, multiverses. And if it couldn't have happened here, well, certainly it must have, because we had a
We're here.
student tell us, well, there's infinite number of universes. So certainly it could happen someplace out there at some point
Yep,
in
yep.
time. but the same arguments exist wherever you're going.
Yeah. So if you're on planet Earth, we have this Earth to deal with. We're not out in some other universe, are we? Yeah. Well,
Right.
some students are, but maybe.
The
So
mechanisms that are given for evolution of mutation and natural selection, you can just say no to those. They cannot explain the origin of new kinds of living things. And when we look at the evidences for evolution, then we can just say no to these evidences that are given in terms of change. But what about similarity? I mean, the books are showing you pictures, what they call similar forms or homology, and they show you the similarity in the bone structure of various creatures. And they'll say, look at that. That shows that we had a common ancestor along with these other creatures. Well, does it really? Just because they look similar, does that mean that they evolved? I've thought of at least 3 different reasons why we might have similarity here that fits with design. Perhaps the reason for that similarity is they were designed for a similar function. And what we're actually seeing is variation on a common theme. Or perhaps that another explanation is it shows us they were designed by the same designer. We have one God, not a pantheon of gods who created. It'd be like going into an art museum and you could recognize the Rembrandt paintings in that museum because of the similarity in the style and the choice of colors and the subject matter and so on. You can see similarity because they were done by one artist. Or another possible explanation for similarity is that these creatures were designed to work together, and we live in an ecosystem or a universe. And so we have the same kinds of chemicals, and these chemicals react in the same kinds of ways. And so we would expect to find some similarity then between these various kinds of creatures. So we have 3 different explanations then of why, and maybe you can think of others. Well, and yet what we find as we go into the textbooks, we see evidences that people will say, oh, look at the similarity. This is a picture of you about 2 months in development inside your mother's womb. And it said, I mean, they're labeled, they say you've got gill slits and a yolk sac and a tail. So that reminds us how similar we are to our fish-like ancestors. Well, is that true? Well, 2 things about the gill slits. They're not gills and they're not slits. So why would they call them gill slits, except they want to show you similarity as evidence of evolution. These structures actually are little pouches that form into the neck and the jaw region of a human being, very important in human development. The part they call a yolk sac is not a yolk sac at all. It's used to create the first blood cells that this little baby needs, and then later on it just is no longer needed and it's able to degenerate and drop off. The tail, what about it? It looks a bit like a tail here. It grows more quickly than the rest of that little baby at that point in time, and then it's just enclosed in the body system. It's just the end of our spinal column. It's got to end someplace, doesn't it? And so none of these things are really what they're trying to show us, the similarity with fish-like ancestors. And yet years ago, Ernst Haeckel was a strong proponent of Darwinian evolution. And he came up with this idea called the biogenetic law, which was the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Now that's a big mouthful, but what it means is the idea was that as the baby developed inside of its mother's womb, it would repeat the stages of evolution. And so he drew these diagrams showing the similarity in these various embryos, and with the idea that that proves evolution. Look how similar they all look. Problem was these diagrams were doctored, they were fraudulent, they should never have been used as good evidence of evolution, and yet they ended up in textbooks for many, many, many years. And in fact, it was disproven back in the 20s even that this was a bad argument, and yet you still do see that in some textbooks and in museums today. It's just plain not good evidence at all. The one they're using a lot today is the idea of biochemical similarity or biochemical homology. And here they will use things like the sequence within the DNA and the RNA, or the sequence of the amino acids in proteins. And the idea is the more similar they are, that we can produce a tree of life. So anything that's close on that tree of life must be very similar. Then you'll see magazine articles, even popular magazine articles like Time Magazine back in 2006 came out with this saying, how we became human. And then it says chimps and humans share almost 99% of their DNA. Well, when you read that, you should ask some questions. You should say, well, how do they know that? First of all, is it really true that it's 99%? And even if it's 99%, does that mean we came from apes and monkeys? Are they truly our nearest relatives in our ancestry? Well, as further research has been done, that figure has gone down and down and down. And we find now that it's more like an evolutionary sprint made us human. Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins was quoted several years ago. He told us 86 to 89% similarity is conservative. He says it looks like it may be as low as 70%. Well, that's a huge difference from 99%, isn't it? But you know what? We went to another museum, I think down in Texas one time, and we found out, according to them, we're 97.5% similar to a mouse. Based on what? Again, sequences, I guess. 92% similar to a zebrafish. And here's my favorite one. We are 50% similar to banana. Now, maybe we evolved from bananas instead. As a creationist, what do I do with that, with these kinds of things? I look at it and I go, well, yes, we're designed by the same designer. Our designer is very efficient and skilled at what he does. And a mouse's systems are quite similar to humans. We would expect some similarity, but we also would expect a lot of differences. And I might also say, if the similarities in chimpanzees, between chimpanzees and humans, has gone down, how much has it gone down between a mouse and a human, and so on. So there was an article a while back in New Scientist. It was called Uprooting, or Darwin Was Wrong, said right on the cover, Cutting Down the Tree of Life. Amazing. In that article, they had a picture of Darwin's first sketch of an evolutionary tree of life. Look what it says up in the corner of that. He said, I think this was just an idea he was playing with. He put it down in his journal, but then it became cemented within science, didn't it, as evidence of evolution. From that article, I found some very interesting quotes. It said, for a long time, the Holy Grail was to build a tree of life. Well, is it really? Go ahead, Dave. A few years ago, it looked as though that grail was within reach, but today the project lies in tatters, torn to pieces by an onslaught of negative evidence. Now, what did they call the negative evidence? What was that? That was new studies that were being done on DNA. That was the studies on the DNA was actually just shredding this whole idea of the tree of life.
Then that was in 2009. It's gotten even worse now for evolutionary ideas.
Yeah, that's true. If you continue in there, they go, the tree of life, one of the iconic concepts of evolution, has turned out to be a figment of our imagination. Now, wait a minute. I thought science was based on observation and experimentation. And, when they come out with these scientific things, you hope it wouldn't just be imagination. And yet we find too often it is just imagination. They said then we have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality. And so I would ask, well, how come it's still in textbooks then? What does it take to get these things out of textbooks? And then one more quote from this article, which I loved. Biology is vastly more complex than we thought. And facing up to this complexity will be Scary, they thought. I don't find it scary. I find it absolutely fascinating and wonderful. It makes me worship the Creator even more as we look at this vastly complex system that we find. It's fun. I've been teaching biology to my grandson and high school biology, and he is just loving it. And we're looking more and more at the complexity. We studied DNA today and the structure of DNA and protein synthesis, and I mean, it's just amazing. I asked him, "Do you think that could happen by accident and chance?" And he's becoming just very enthralled with the complexity that we see at the molecular level. And so, yes, this tree of life has been cut down, actually, cut down by science itself. And we can just reject that. So when it comes
What
to,
were the actions or the reactions of other scientists to that scientific article?
go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, they were really upset. Okay. They were upset that that magazine was bold enough to say there's a problem with Darwinian evolution and the tree of life. They said, oh, wow, you guys aren't scientists anymore because you're attacking one of our gods, you might say. Okay, the god of evolution. And one of the prophets would be Darwin. And so that was basically, they really got mad. They wrote in and they were encouraging people to cancel their subscriptions to New Scientists, etc. And so, yep, they wanted to cancel even New Scientist magazine because how dare they
Cancel
attack Darwin?
culture was alive and well in 2009, huh?
Yeah, it was. All right.
Alrighty, so change and similarity, we can just say no. The evidence doesn't really prove evolution at all. But what about this third one? The idea is called junk. Dave, you want to talk a little bit about junk?
Yeah, they used to have a list of about 180 things, even in the human body, that they called junk, which is supposedly leftovers that we don't really need anymore, but they're leftovers from millions and millions of years of evolution. And according to evolutionary model, you would expect to see some bunch of junk out there. All right. But they have the list of 180 things. And now they're down to just a few. But here are ones that they thought were junk, the pituitary gland. And now they realize pituitary gland is the master gland of the body, definitely used in regulation, right? The thymus, the tonsils, the appendix, all very important in immunity. What does the appendix do? You know, that is the biggest one that most students will be taught. Oh, that proves evolution. Well, you better have a whole lot more evidence if you want to prove evolution. But quite honestly, the appendix has a very important use too in immunity. And when you get violently sick, where it's actually coming out both ends, you might say, you're really bad off. It turns out you clean out the intestinal tract, and what's going on is you need to reboot that particular system with beneficial bacteria. Otherwise, you won't do very well. So God placed something in there called your appendix, which is a safe harbor for beneficial uh, uh, bacteria. And did I say mutation before? Beneficial bacteria. And the bacteria now will reproduce and reboot the system. So I think it's a very important little piece of our anatomy. What about the wisdom teeth? Uh, that poses a real problem for a lot of people, especially in an American culture that probably eats a lot of mush, a lot of white bread, a lot of things. And we're not using our jaws to basically crunch some heavy stuff. Well, what are the wisdom teeth really for? Chewing.
Chewing.
Is that a Chinese word? Chewing?
Yes, yes.
Very important in our life is to chew, and that's good.
There was
Here's
a
another
claim,
junk.
yeah, years ago, there was a claim when they first were able to sequence the DNA molecule of humans, and they said 98, 97, or 98% of our DNA is junk. It's left over from millions of years of evolution. It has no function, basically. Well, when we heard that, we said that we don't buy that. Our prediction is it's not junk. Go back to the lab, do more research. We predict you're going to find that these sections of DNA have a function. And sure enough, as time went on, unfortunately, it didn't take millions of years for this one, but our prediction was verified. And as they've been looking at these sections of the DNA that they thought were junk, they're finding out that these sections have a function to it. In fact, Dr. John Sanford says it is becoming increasingly clear that most or all of the genome is functional. Now, they may not be used in protein synthesis, but they're used in other kinds of things. Jonathan Wells, again, back in 2011, wrote a book called The Myth of Junk DNA. And then in, 2012, there was an international consortium, 300 plus international genetic researchers who were involved in a research project to try to determine what do these sections do? Do they have a function? And at the end of their project, they said almost every nucleotide is associated with a function. They're not just leftover junk. They actually said later on that the metaphor of junk isn't that useful. And in Discover magazine, analyzing this data, they said the key point is it's not junk, which fits exactly with what we were predicting in the creation model. So what do some of these things do? Well, these sections of DNA are important for repairing DNA, or assisting in DNA replication, regulating DNA transcription, aiding in folding of chromosomes, and aiding in the maintenance of the chromosomes, controlling RNA editing and splicing, helping fight disease, and regulating embryonic development. If we didn't have these, we wouldn't even be here, would we? Because they're used in embryonic development. And so as we go on from there, we just say, well, it's not junk, is it? 20 years after they first called it junk, we can say confidently, no, it's not junk. It looks designed. And as we were going just today, as I was going over the structure of the DNA molecules with my grandson, I was like, wow, it certainly does look designed. It's like a computer program. We had in these classes we did for people from Costa Rica, we had a computer software engineer in there, and he did a little program on showing how the sequencing and how DNA works and comparing it to computer software. Just amazing.
So it's no junk. All three of the supposed evidences of evolution, you can just say no to. It's not the type of change that evolution requires. The similarity, that doesn't prove anything whatsoever. And junk, what they thought was junk, is very useful instead. You know, Charles Darwin thought a cell was just a blob of protoplasm, like like jelly or jello or something like that. He didn't know very much about the inner workings of the cell, did he? Yeah, he really didn't. He found out later in a book written in 1984, the cell is like a city. It has transport. It has computer centers. It has a sewer system. It's a manufacturing plant, you might say, chemical manufacturing. Guards on the gate. It's like a city. It is an amazing, complex structure, and you can't even see it without a microscope. Isn't that something? And when you look in a microscope, you find out how complex this cell is. And then thinking is okay. Okay? You can think and it's okay. Let me give you one example just to show you how precise the city is, how sophisticated of a city you would be in. Clear back in 1984, I believe it was Michael Denton, Dr. Denton, that says if you were to enter into a city, into the city of a cell, in other words, if you were to magnify the cell large enough to go into and walked inside, you would find yourself in a world of supreme technology. Okay? Bewildering complexity. Now, to say it all happened by accident, taxes credulity. Okay? But anyhow, let's just look at one right now. I'd like to look at what's going on in order to get a working protein and to put it into place and what it's going to be used for. Real simple. Okay, you have DNA. The very first thing, oh, that's not simple, is it?
Not simple.
uh, the DNA molecule is like a ladder that's twisted. In order to even use it, you have to separate the rungs. All right. So you've got to have something that's going to unwind that DNA in order to even be able to use it to code for one of those proteins I was talking about. Remember, one protein, the chance is like finding a red marble in a universe filled with green marbles. Okay, 3 times in a row. And that's a lot easier than making a protein. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is unwind that particular DNA. And then you take a picture of a section of the DNA. You make a copy of it. I call it a picture. Okay, you take a copy of that one section because you don't want to use the original. You take that copy now, call transport or UPS to take that copy and bring it into what's called a ribosome. And those are the little tiny dots on the outside of that particular nucleus there. So you look at that ribosome and you say, okay, that's what's going to actually synthesize the computer part of that program to make a chain of beads. Get every amino acid in exactly the right spot. Not going to happen by accident, but that's what it says. That's what naturalism would teach. So you get this chain, and the ribosome finally produces it, pushes it out. Now you call the transport machine to go into a folding machine because that is just a string of beads. It's not going to do a lot of good for the machine that's going to go into, say. So you have to fold it to a precise arrangement. And so the UPS is called again. It goes into the folding machine. Now it's folded. And now it's a working protein. Now you see it's folded specifically with all the different type of amino acids put together, all the colors together, okay? But now what's going to happen here? Well, you call the transport machine, and that transport machine is going to carry it over to make a machine that you can't even see with your eye that's going to make energy for you. Okay? That's the machine. And this UPS guy, or the transport system, is called the Kinesin Transport System. And it was only the advent of very, very sophisticated models of the electron microscope, scanning microscope. It was only then they were able to do that and be able to figure out what's going on. Inside your cell, there are other proteins working to build a highway. So this is highway construction proteins working in here. And that is going to make a highway from one part of the cell to another part of the cell. And then the UPS guy is going to run down that highway to deliver that perfectly folded protein plus a bunch of others to the right spots in all different parts of that cell. And guess what? That's what it really looks like. It looks like a skinny guy there running down the highway, carrying this big sack of proteins, and then goes into that particular machine. But that's going to need more than one protein. In fact, it's going to take, I think, 32 proteins to make a machine that's going to produce the energy that you need. You know, Howard Berg from Harvard University is talking about the machines in humans that they didn't even know existed a number of years ago, just a few years back. And he calls them the most efficient machines in the universe. That's from Harvard, okay? The more they study, the more complex things get, okay? And when I actually looked at that, you say, you got all this stuff working together. Copy machines, transport machines, UPS, you've got the highway construction, all going on in the cell. And I finished talking about that. And then we came to the question and answer time. And a very well-known atheist in Minnesota had finally asked a question. He said, I came here to hear evidence of design. You didn't give me any evidence. Was he asleep just a second ago? Okay. He said, if you don't give me evidence right now, I'm going to, what do you think he's going to do? Throw up all over the auditorium seat in front of me. Okay. About that time, there's an engineer in the back of the audience who recognizes design. And he said, give him a bag. I thought that was so classic. All right. But keep in mind what's going on. According to Dr. Scott Todd, who says we shouldn't even allow the possibility of intelligent design, he says this, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. And again, I want to emphasize, students, you are taught only, and almost always in most schools, only naturalism, that you have to explain everything strictly by naturalistic processes without any God whatsoever. Do you like being put in a box? I hope not. I don't. And so I hope thinking is allowed. Okay? Remember, evolution is not science. It's strictly a philosophy that is posing as science. I believe the evidence cries out, created with a design. I see it, but then I don't feel I have to explain everything from a naturalistic perspective. If God created, that's supernatural right there, isn't it? I believe there is a God who puts so much design that if we ignore it, we're greatly at fault. We are ignoring the real thing behind all this stuff in the universe. Okay, so that's what this creation versus evolution crash class is about. This session on biology and design. I'm hoping you can stand a little bit more firm just from what you heard yet this evening. And I'm going to give you a chance for some questions and answer in just a minute here. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at this one concept that the greatest proof of evolution is the fossil record. Is it really? Going to find out it doesn't support evolution at all. And so that's tomorrow night. And so we're going to
October
look at
4th.
amazing evidence of design and some of the, oh, wait a minute. We're going to give creation tours as well.
Right, you said it's September 13. You forgot to
Yeah,
change that. Should be October
yeah,
4th.
I'm sorry. It's not September 13. When is it?
October 4th.
October
4th.
4th. Okay, that's tomorrow. Okay.
So we saw
All
some
right.
evidence of design
Yeah, I
tonight.
forgot to change these slides. I'm sorry.
We have a
But
whole
this one is great.
program just on design in Costa Rica. And We've been to Costa Rica numerous times, doing ministry down there, speaking in churches and on the university campus and schools and so on. And we enjoyed the country so much, we thought, well, other people would enjoy coming down. And so we put together a creation tour of Costa Rica. That will be February 25 through March 5 next year, 2024. That, I believe, is the correct date. And
Yep.
so you want to mark your calendar for that. We'd love to have you come with us to Costa Rica and see the amazing, amazing design of the creatures down there. And you know, as we look at design, it just makes us want to worship our Creator.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
we also do tours of Yellowstone. If you want to come with us to Yellowstone, we are right now planning 2 or 3 different tour groups to Yellowstone next year. One of them will be early in June, or probably about mid-June, and the others will be towards the end of the summer. And again, looking at amazing features of design as well. In the Yellowstone tour, we look a lot at the fire and ice, we like to say, because hot spot on the earth, and there's also so much evidence of thermal activity and then evidence of the ice in the past from the ice age. We also have a free newsletter. You can get that in a hard copy if you want to give us your address and name, and we'll be happy to send that to you, or you can sign up to get it online. And if you want to do that, just go online, discovercreation.org, and sign up for the RSS feed for that.
One of the things I want to say about that too is if you're interested in Costa Rica, please email me and I'll give you a lot more information on that. And your email to me will be davenutting@discovercreation.org. Okay? And so please email that one, davenutting@discovercreation.org, or call our office and talk to Gail. But I'd like to talk to you about that particular tour in person. It is an amazing, amazing tour. And so, again, if you like to see us to be able to do more crash classes or expand the ministry of AOI, notice when you go to our front page on Think and Believe, there's a little thing called donate. And we really would appreciate even more and more and more monthly kind of donations as well. And so help us. And we hope you also get involved in helping students keep from getting run over by the semi-truck of evolution. Okay, so anyhow.
There are more resources online on the website if you want to look at that. We have a DVD set with a really comprehensive study guide. You could use that if you wanted to teach a class for Sunday school or a youth group or a home group or just for your own study. And so that's available, $35 special price on that. Also, we have the High-Tech Cell we would recommend by Dr. Robert Carter. And that's only $10. It's on the DNA, very amazing. And then John Sanford's book, Genetic Entropy, that we talked about tonight. There's also a series of devotionals, and we love these. Here's one of them is Have You Considered? But these are day-by-day devotionals, 1 page each day. And, it's like eating a bite, just a taste of creation every day, which will help because it's not all crammed into one seminar, one crash class, and you get a little bite each day. We highly recommend that. And for those of you that are looking for Christmas gifts, perhaps for your family, these books make a great gift that will help to really fortify your family.
The latest one in that series is actually called Without Excuse. It's a takeoff from Romans chapter 1. That when you look at the creation, God says you are without excuse if you don't honor and glorify your Creator as a result. Okay? And so Without Excuses is another one in this series, full color, all the way through these books. And just 1 page per day. And I think it's really wonderful way to be able to fortify yourself if you want to study on creation.
All right, and we are very, very blessed that God has given us a property that's just a half a block from Colorado Mesa University here in Grand Junction, Colorado. And we are developing an on-campus outreach to the campus, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 students over there, just a half a block from us. And so it's a real opportunity. Adam and Brian have been going out a lot. They've been taking their families. They're doing some creative things to meet students and to begin to have opportunities to talk with and develop some kind of a friendship with these students so that we can speak into their lives. And so that's a ministry that AOI is really focused on right now.
A
But
part of our ministry. Okay.
yeah, we do
Yeah.
a lot of various things, but anyway, discovercreation.org, and we want to encourage you, discover creation, but don't worship the creation, worship the creator. That's the
Right.
whole purpose in studying what he's made, is that we might really be in awe and wonder at this wonderful creator that we have. And we want to let you know, you guys got the deluxe version tonight because we went overtime, but
Yep.
we give you a lot more information perhaps than what we have done on some of the programs. And so you got the expanded version tonight. Thank you for sticking with us, those of you that are on here live and those that will watch it in replays later. God bless you. If you have questions, you can raise your hand or turn on your camera or just put it in the chat or let us know. Anybody
You'll have to unmute yourself if you're muted.
Yeah, hi, Ed. Did you have a question or comment?
I was just going to say, you guys are out in Colorado. Do you work with Jason Lyle at all out there?
Actually, we're in Grand Junction, Colorado. Jason's over near Colorado Springs, and we don't work directly with him, but we appreciate his work, and yeah, he does a great job.
You both do. That was very interesting. I love the complexity of the cell. I heard somebody say one time that if you were to take a human cell, a typical human cell, and you were to expand it into a size that was capable of allowing you to walk through it and see all the detail of it, it would be the size of Manhattan.
Yeah.
So much complexity in it.
Pretty complex. It's amazing, really. And
It's absolutely beautiful.
The neat thing about what God has made, the closer you look, the better it gets.
Yeah.
When you look at what people make, the closer you look, I mean, if you're looking at a nicely polished piece of furniture or something, the closer you look, you see scratches and imperfections and whatever. But with what God has created, the closer you look, the better it gets. It's pretty easy.
Exactly.
Any other comments or questions?
And by the way, that one book written by Dr. Michael Denton in 1984 talked about expanding the city the size of the cell, the size of a large city, such as New York. And then, Michael Denton wrote another book, an update to that, Evolution. Instead of Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, it was called Evolution, a Theory Still in Crisis. And that was 2016 when that was published.
So have you studied creation quite a bit, Ed?
Oh, not as deeply as I think I should, probably. But yes, I do. I'm very interested in God's creation. I love looking at it, that's for sure, and I love being in it. But I used to see, what have I gotten? I've gotten you're talking about that butterfly. What was that called again? That butterfly?
The blue morpho.
Blue morpho.
The blue morpho. Yeah, they had one in and that clear scale reflected or allowed through the blue light. But there's a butterfly they had in Answers magazine this issue that's clear. It has clear wings that goes straight through it. So but it looks like glass, but you can see the scales.
Yeah, right.
It's truly amazing.
Yeah,
but I got a CRSQ for a while. I let that slip, but I need to get that back because I really love that. Creation magazine, the Creation Journal, Answers in Genesis has their own journal.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Lots of stuff out there. David
There
Reeves
is.
is going. He's going ballistic right now. He's got his big gigantic museum open up in a few days.
Yes. Yep.
Mhm.
We have an arsenal to work with. That's for sure, don't we? And
We
it's
do.
all around us. It's the entire world. It's a universe. Praise the Lord
Exactly.
for that.
Exactly. Well, thank you for coming tonight, Ed and Bill.
Thank you for having it.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions or comments? If not, I think we will call it good for tonight, and we hope you'll come back tomorrow. We're going to be looking at the fossil record. Is that right, Dave?
Yeah,
For
that's
tomorrow?
exactly it.
And
And
fossils are important because they're really the only hard facts that you have from the earth, right? In fact, there was a book on creation years back that was called Evolution, or Creation, the Hard Facts from the Earth on fossils. And I thought the fossils were the very best evidence of evolution. And come to find out, they're not the best evidence at all. There's lots of problems with the fossil record as evidence of creation. So if you can come back tomorrow or catch the replay, if you can't be with us live, that would be great. If any of you are interested in any of these trips that we talked about, or if you're interested in more training, we're in the process of training people who would like to be able to share more with Creation Ministries. And so if that interests you, get a hold of us. We have had we had one intern couple that was here with us for a full year. And they are very interested in children's ministry. And then we have another couple that came this summer who are working with Brian on doing the campus outreach. And so we're eager to train. If you know young people that want to be trained, or if they want to go to a secular university, but they want to be discipled while they're there, that's the purpose of the building. We're in the process of remodeling the upstairs of our office building, and it will be 3 apartments up there for students. And our goal is to establish like a discipleship program for those students so that they can learn more about creation and they can be a force on the campus next door. And so we have room either for people that want to go to college over there or that might want to come as an intern. So if you know students like that, we'd really appreciate it if you help us get the word out. And if you can help, if you know anybody that might be interested in the programs tomorrow and the next night, please give them the link or tell them to go register. So we'll get their information and we can give them a link. But anyway, God bless you. And thank you for coming.